The rain had been wrong all year. Not absent, wrong. It came in sheets when the ground was already full, then disappeared for 6 weeks when the corn was silking and desperate. By August of 1978, the fields along the eastern ridge of Audrain County, Missouri, smelled not of earth and growth, but of something older and sadder, dust-laced with chemical residue, a thin chemical sweetness that caught in the back of your throat and didn't leave. And on a Tuesday morning, August 22nd, to be exact, a man named Eldon Marsh climbed down from a rusted 1961 Farmall 560 and stood at the edge of his north pasture and looked at what the season had done to him. He didn't curse, he didn't kick the dirt. He just knelt down, pressed 2 fingers into the cracked earth, held them there for a moment like he was taking a pulse, and then he stood back up and said very quietly to nobody in particular, "All right then." That was it, 2 words, the whole of his response to a catastrophe that would have broken most men. What happened next, over the following 4 years, is the kind of story that doesn't fit neatly into any textbook, any extension office pamphlet, or any agricultural sales brochure. It's the story of a man who went backward to go forward, who listened to the land when the land had stopped speaking to nearly everyone else. And the men who laughed at him, the ones who called him foolish, stubborn, and worse, most of them don't farm anymore. Eldon Marsh does. Let me tell you about Audrain County, Missouri, in the summer of 1978. Sit with this for a moment. The county sits in the north-central part of the state, in a region locals call the Little Dixie Belt, rich, rolling prairie that had been farmed continuously since the 1830s. The Missouri River Oxbow bends south of it. The small town of Mexico, Missouri, population about 12,000, serves as the county seat. It's a place where the county fair still mattered, where farmers still gathered at the co-op diner on Route 22 before sunup, where the smell of diesel and frying eggs mixed together into something that felt, if you grew up there, like the smell of home itself. By 1978, Audrain County was a paradox. On paper, it was prosperous. Corn prices had been climbing steadily since the early 70s, and Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, had spent years preaching a gospel that every farmer in America had heard and most had believed: get big or get out, plant fence row to fence row, borrow against the land, buy the bigger tractor, buy the chemicals. The soil is just a medium, a biological hotel for roots. The chemistry does the real work. And so they had planted. Lord, had they planted. Fields that had lain in rotation, fields that had rested under hay and clover, fields that had hosted cattle whose manure had fed the ground for decades, all of it broken up, all of it put to corn year after year, and in the short term it had worked. The yields went up, the bank accounts swelled. But the soil, the actual living, breathing, fungal, bacterial, worm-threaded community of life in the ground, the soil was tired, exhausted. It had given, and in return had received only nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in synthetic form. The organic matter percentage in many Audrain County fields, which should have sat at 4 or 5% on well-managed ground, had dropped below 2. In some fields, below 1. The earth was not dead, but it was hollowed out. That August, the smell of it said so, hot, thin, a little sour. The cracks in the clay subsoil ran deep enough to swallow a man's hand to the wrist. And somewhere along the eastern ridge, on 340 acres that had been in the Marsh family since 1911, a 53-year-old farmer was about to try something that would make his neighbors think he had lost his mind. Eldon Ray Marsh was not an impressive man to look at. 5'9", maybe 160 pounds in wet clothes. He had the particular kind of leanness you only get from decades of physical work, not sculpted, just compressed, like the excess had been worn away by 10,000 mornings of necessity. His hands were enormous relative to the rest of him, wide, rough-knuckled, permanently stained at the creases with the kind of grease and soil that no amount of lava soap fully removes. He had graduated from Mexico High School in 1943, gone overseas with the Army's 35th Infantry Division, come back in 1946, married a woman named Ruth Ellen Goodall, and walked back onto land his grandfather had broken sod on. He never went to the University of Missouri. He never attended an ag extension seminar, at least not voluntarily. He was, by the definitions of his era, a small farmer, unincorporated, no hired men. Just him, Ruth, and their son Dale, who was 22 in 1978 and beginning to wonder if the farm would be worth inheriting. What Eldon had that no diploma could give him was memory. He remembered his grandfather, Oscar Marsh, and the way Oscar had run cattle through every field in sequence. Never the same field 2 years in a row, always leaving a year of clover and grass between corn seasons. He remembered the smell of Oscar's ground, rich, dark, like chocolate and coffee, and something wilder underneath, the smell of a living system that fed itself. He remembered watching Oscar walk a field the way some men read a newspaper, picking up a handful of soil and rolling it between his palms, holding it to his nose, pressing it into a ball to test its structure. Oscar used to say, "You don't farm the crop, boy, you farm the dirt. Get the dirt right, the crop takes care of itself." Eldon had tried to farm the modern way through the early 70s. He'd borrowed from the Farmers Production Credit Association in Mexico to buy inputs: anhydrous ammonia, 28% nitrogen solution, herbicides. He'd planted continuous corn on his best ground for 5 years running, and for a while it had worked. But by 1977, he was spending $38 per acre on fertilizer and chemicals for yields that were declining even as the costs went up. His soil tests from the University of Missouri Extension Office showed organic matter at 1.4%. His infiltration rate, how fast water moved into his soil, had slowed to a crawl. In the big August rains, water sheeted off his fields like they were parking lots. He had done the math on a piece of notebook paper one night at the kitchen table. He showed it to Ruth's. She looked at it for a long moment and said, "So we go back to Oscar's way." And Eldon said, "I don't know if we have a choice." Now let me tell you about Gary Pitchford. Gary Pitchford was 38 years old in 1978, and he was exactly the kind of man that a certain kind of era produces: large, loud, and absolutely certain that the future belonged to him and people like him. He farmed 1,800 acres south of Mexico, most of it rented from 3 different landowners who were dazzled by his operation's scale and his easy confidence. He drove a brand new 1978 John Deere 4440 130 horsepower, cab and air, a $34,000 machine that gleamed green and yellow like it had been built by people who understood that farming was now an industry. He had a second tractor, a John Deere 4240, for backup. He had a center pivot irrigation system on his best 300 acres. He had a hired man named Ronnie who showed up 6 days a week. Gary was not evil, let's be fair to him. He was a product of his moment, a man who had absorbed every message his industry sent him and believed it completely, the way an intelligent person can believe something completely if everyone around them believes it too. He was also the kind of man who found other people's doubt amusing. He sat at the counter of the co-op diner every morning, stool third from the left always, and he held court. He talked inputs, he talked yield projections, he talked equipment, he subscribed to 3 farm magazines and read them like scripture. When the local extension agent, a young man named Phil Cross, came through to give a talk on new herbicide applications, Gary sat in the front row and asked the first question. Gary Pitchford was the future, as far as Gary Pitchford was concerned. And when word got around, as word always does in small counties, that Eldon Marsh was pulling his north 80 acres out of corn production and seeding it down to red clover and orchard grass, and turning cattle onto his other fields in rotation, and was planning to run no synthetic nitrogen on anything for the coming season. Gary heard about it at the co-op diner on a Wednesday morning in October 1978. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at the men around him. And then he laughed, not a polite chuckle, a full, genuine, head-back laugh that made the woman behind the counter look up from the grill. "Clover," he said, "Eldon Marsh is going back to Clover." The confrontation, the real one, the one people in Audrain County still talk about if you know who to ask, happened at the Audrain County Soil and Water Conservation District annual meeting, held on the evening of November 14, 1978, in the basement of the Mexico First United Methodist Church. About 60 farmers attended, metal folding chairs, a screen at the front for slides, coffee in a big silver urn that had been making the same slightly burnt coffee since approximately 1962. Phil Cross from the Extension Office was supposed to give a presentation on soil compaction and the new deep-ripping practices being recommended for heavy clay soils in northern Missouri. Eldon came because Ruth made him. "You need to hear what they're saying," she told him, "even if you've already decided." He sat near the back. He wore his good flannel shirt, the dark green one with no holes in the elbows. Phil Cross's presentation was competent and cautious. He talked about subsoil compaction from heavy equipment. He talked about the importance of maintaining soil organic matter. He mentioned, almost in passing, that some researchers at the University of Missouri were looking at legume cover crops as a way to reduce nitrogen fertilizer costs. That was when Gary Pitchford, sitting 4 rows from the front, turned in his chair. "Phil," he said loud enough for the room, "you're not suggesting these boys go back to farming like it's 1940, are you?" Polite laughter, not cruel, just the reflexive laughter of men who agreed. Phil, to his credit, tried to stay measured. "No, Gary, I'm just saying that the research shows legumes can contribute." "I know what the research shows," Gary said. "I also know what my yield monitor shows." He let that sit. "Then, I just think there's a reason we moved past clover rotations. We moved past them because they don't pencil out. You can't feed the country on nostalgia." More laughter. And then from the back of the room, Eldon Marsh's voice, quiet but carrying. "Depends on what you mean by pencil out." The room shifted, heads turned. Gary turned too, and when he saw who had spoken, something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, not quite contempt, something in between. "Eldon, didn't know you were here." "Been here the whole time." "Well," Gary leaned back in his chair, comfortable, "you going to tell us about your Clover experiment?" "Not tonight." "Wise, probably better to wait and see if you have anything to show for it." He turned back to the front, done with it. But then he added, and this is the part that mattered, the part that lodged in Eldon's chest like a splinter. "I'll tell you what, Eldon, you run your Clover for 3 years, and if your yields on that north ground beat mine, I'll buy you dinner at the steakhouse." He said it lightly, like it was a joke. "Of course, if they don't, you might want to look into whether that ground's still worth farming." A few men laughed, a few didn't. Eldon said nothing. He drank his coffee. He drove home in his '74 Ford pickup on roads that smelled of river mud and wood smoke, and when he got to the kitchen, Ruth asked how the meeting was, and he said, "Fine." He didn't mention the bet. But he didn't forget it either. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone dismissed you, not with anger but with laughter? There's something about that particular dismissal that either breaks you or builds something very hard and very quiet inside you. Which do you think it did to Eldon Marsh? Here is what Eldon Marsh knew that Gary Pitchford did not. He knew it not from journals or university bulletins, but from his grandfather Oscar, from his own 30 years of watching, and from a series of conversations with a man named Harold Fenton, a retired agronomist who had worked for the Missouri Department of Agriculture from 1948 to 1971, and who now kept a small farm near Ladonia, about 12 miles east of Mexico. Eldon had started visiting Harold in the spring of 1977 when his soil tests came back, and he sat with the numbers long enough to understand that something was deeply wrong. Harold was 71 years old, stiff in the hips, and absolutely unsentimental. He looked at Eldon's soil tests the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, with clinical interest and zero drama. "Your organic matter is gone," Harold said. "You know what organic matter is, really? It's the bank account. It's where the nutrients live between the time you put them in and the time the plant needs them. You've drawn the account down to nearly zero. Now every dollar you deposit goes right out the bottom." This was the first thing Eldon learned. Synthetic nitrogen applied to depleted soil doesn't stay. With low organic matter, there's nothing to hold it. It leaches, it volatilizes, it leaves. You apply 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre and the plant might capture 40 of them. The rest is gone. You pay for it anyway. The second thing Harold showed him was a textbook from 1934, Soils and Men, the USDA's Yearbook of Agriculture from that year, a thick green volume that smelled of old libraries and serious thought. Harold opened it to a chapter on legumes and nitrogen fixation, and he walked Eldon through what every agronomist of the pre-chemical era knew by heart. Red clover, when properly inoculated with the right rhizobium bacteria, can fix between 100 and 200 pounds of atmospheric nitrogen per acre per year. Biologically, for free, not applied from a truck, pulled from the air itself, converted by the bacteria that live in nodules on the clover roots and deposited into the soil in organic form. In organic form, it doesn't leach, it doesn't volatilize, it becomes part of the organic matter, it rebuilds the bank account. And when you plow clover down, or better, when cattle graze it and their manure returns it to the soil, the nitrogen releases slowly over 2 and 3 years, precisely when growing crops need it. Your grandfather knew this, Harold told Eldon. Farmers knew this for 5,000 years. We had to pay Monsanto and Standard Oil to make us forget it. The third thing Eldon learned was about soil biology, the fungal networks, the earthworms, the microbial communities that are responsible for making nutrients available to plant roots. These organisms need organic matter to survive. Continuous tillage and synthetic chemistry don't kill them overnight, but they suppress them steadily, year by year, until you have soil that is biologically sterile, technically capable of growing a crop, but only if you inject everything the crop needs artificially, because the natural systems that used to provide it have collapsed. Rebuilding those systems takes time, 3 to 5 years, Harold said. There's no shortcut. What you're asking, Harold said to Eldon at one point, leaning forward over his kitchen table, is whether you can afford to farm at a loss for 3 years to get back something that will earn for the next 30. Eldon looked at the soil tests again, at the math on the notebook paper. What I'm asking, he said, is whether I can afford not to. Here was Eldon's plan, worked out over the winter of 1970-1979 with Harold's guidance and his own memory of Oscar's rotation. Year 1, 1979. Seed the north 80 acres to a mixture of red clover and orchard grass. Seed the west 60 acres to winter wheat, which he would harvest in July and then relay crop into soybeans. Maintain corn on the remaining ground, his best structured ground near the creek, but reduce nitrogen application by 40% and replace it with manure from his small beef herd, which would be moved through the fields in the fall after harvest. Year 2, 1980, graze the clover heavily with cattle through late spring, then clip it in July. Plow down the clover biomass in September. Test the soil again in November. Year 3, 1981, plant corn on the former clover ground with 0 synthetic nitrogen. Let the soil speak. It was not a safe plan. It was not a guaranteed plan. Harold himself said, I believe this will work. I have seen it work. But I cannot promise you anything, Eldon. The soil is not a machine. Eldon said, I know that. That's the whole point. He borrowed $8,000 from the First National Bank of Mexico, using the farm truck and some equipment as collateral, to carry him through the transition. He bought a used 1969 New Idea Model 323 manure spreader for $1,200. He sourced inoculated red clover seed from a small seed dealer in Moberly, paying $2.40 per pound for the treated seed. He spent 2 evenings in the barn with Dale, who was skeptical but willing, walking through the plan step by step. Ruth made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and listened and said nothing, which was her way of saying she was in. Let me take you into the spring of 1981. April in Audrain County, Missouri, has a particular quality of light, low and gold in the mornings. The sun coming up across the rolling ground in long horizontal shafts that make even tired farmland look like something a painter invented. The redbuds were blooming along the fence lines. The creek that ran along the south edge of Eldon's property, Coal Branch, a modest and reliable little waterway, was running clear and brown with tannins, its banks soft and smelling of mud and new green. Eldon had been in the north field before sunrise. He did what Oscar had taught him. He knelt at the edge of the old clover ground, the 80 acres that had rested, been grazed, been plowed, been rested again, and he pressed his fingers into the earth. It was different. Anyone who farms will understand what I mean when I say that soil has a quality that you feel before you measure. The structure was there, the soft, almost springy resistance of ground that has its crumb structure back, that has earthworm channels threading through it, that has root channels from 2 years of clover sending moisture and air deep into the profile. He brought a handful to his nose. There it was. That smell, the smell of Oscar's ground, rich, alive, complex, like fresh bread and dark coffee and something wilder underneath. The smell that the textbooks call petrichor, but that farmers just call good dirt. He took a soil probe and pulled 6 cores at random across the field. He mixed them, let them dry slightly on the tailgate of his truck, and drove them 40 miles to the Boone County Extension Office in Columbia, where a technician named Sandra Wickham processed them the same afternoon because Eldon had called ahead. The results came back 3 days later. Organic matter 2.8%. Not perfect, not Oscar's ground, not yet, but up from 1.4%, nearly doubled in 3 years, and the biological tests, the CO2 respiration measure that indicates microbial activity, were strong. The soil was alive again. He planted corn on that 80 acres on May 3, 1981, using his 1968 John Deere 7000 planter, a 6-row unit he kept meticulously maintained, adjusting the seed plates himself in the shop every winter. He planted DeKalb DK636, a corn hybrid that was solid and consistent in Audrain County, not the highest yield hybrid on the market, but one that he knew performed in his soils. He applied no synthetic nitrogen, none, $0 per acre for nitrogen fertilizer on that field. He applied 2 tons per acre of composted beef manure from his own herd, spread with the old New Idea spreader in early April before tillage. That was it. His total input cost on the North 80, $31 per acre, including seed, fuel, and manure handling. Gary Pitchford was spending $89 per acre on inputs on his comparable ground that same spring, anhydrous ammonia at $178 per ton, herbicides, a pre-plant insecticide application. Let me pause here and ask you something. When do you think Eldon started to know? Was it when the corn emerged, thick and even and dark green, in rows so uniform they looked machined? Was it midsummer when he walked the rows and found them knee-high in June, chest-high by 4th of July? Or was it one specific moment in late July when a 6-week dry stretch hit Audrain County and the shallow-rooted corn on the compacted soils began to fire, to roll its leaves, to show the gray-green of stress, and Eldon's north field stayed dark green? When do you think he knew? The dry stretch of July 1981 was the difference maker. It lasted 38 days without meaningful rain. Temperatures pushed into the mid-90s. In those conditions, the soil's water-holding capacity is everything. Sandy or depleted soils lose moisture fast. Well-structured, high organic matter soils hold it. They hold it because the organic matter itself acts like a sponge. Each percentage point of organic matter allows the soil to hold an additional 1.5 inches of plant-available water per foot of depth. Gary Pitchford's fields, his best continuous corn ground, now in its 6th year of that rotation, showed stress by August 3rd. Leaf rolling by morning, some tip firing on the ears. His hired man Ronnie told Gary about it, and Gary drove out and looked, and Gary said what a lot of men said that summer: "It's just the weather, nothing you can do about the weather." Eldon's North 80 did not fire. It stood green and full through the dry stretch, pulling moisture from 18, 20, 24 inches down, following the old Clover root channels that had opened the subsoil, drinking from a reserve that shallower-rooted, conventionally farmed soil simply couldn't access. By the 2nd week of August, farmers were stopping on the road that ran along the north fence line and looking. They didn't stop to be complimentary, they stopped because it didn't make sense to them. A field that had been in clover and grass for 2 years, a field with no commercial nitrogen, was standing as good as anything in the county, better than some fields that had received full fertility programs. Dale Marsh, driving the tractor along the east margin of that field in early August, later said that he had to stop and just sit for a minute. Not from emotion, he wasn't a sentimental young man, but from the plain fact of looking at something and understanding for the first time in a deep way that his father had been right. He called from the field to the farmhouse that evening. Ruth answered. "Mom," Dale said, "you should come look at the north field." Ruth said, "I know, your father went out before breakfast." Harvest came in October. Eldon ran his 1972 International 1440 combine, a machine 12 years old by then, maintained with the kind of obsessive care that small farmers give machines they cannot afford to replace, through the North 80 over 3 days in mid-October. His yield monitor, a simple mechanical bushel counter, not the digital systems Gary Pitchford had, showed him what he'd harvested, and he double-checked it against his grain cart and his elevator tickets. The North 80 averaged 142 bushels per acre. At 15.5% moisture at the elevator in Mexico at $2.91 per bushel, the going price that October, that was $413.22 per acre in gross revenue. His input cost, $31 per acre. Net margin on that field, $382 per acre. Gary Pitchford's best comparable fields that year came in at 134 bushels per acre, on soils that had been irrigated twice and received full fertility programs. His input cost was $89 per acre, his net margin, $300 per acre. Eldon made $82 more per acre on his clover-rebuilt ground with zero synthetic nitrogen in a drought year with a 12-year-old combine, on a field his neighbors had watched with polite skepticism for 3 years. He didn't call Gary, he didn't say anything at the co-op diner. He just drove his grain to town, kept his mouth closed, and waited. The silence came at the elevator. The farmer's elevator in Mexico, Missouri, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business because everyone's grain was going through the same scale, the same dump pit, the same set of tickets that the elevator manager, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Darrell Sims, kept in duplicate. Farmers talked at the elevator the way women were supposed to talk at quilting bees, which is to say freely and with no particular restraint. Word got around. It got around not because Eldon told anyone, but because Darrell Sims happened to mention Eldon's yields to 2 other farmers who came in that same afternoon, and because farming communities are small enough that a surprising elevator ticket is public news by suppertime. By the following Tuesday, the story was at the co-op diner. Gary Pitchford heard it from Ronnie, who had heard it from a farmer named Curtis Van Buren, who had been at the elevator when someone mentioned the number. Gary was quiet about it. That is what the men who were there remember most, how quiet he was. He asked a few careful questions. He was told that yes, it was the North 80, the field that had been in Clover, that Eldon had run no commercial nitrogen, that the yields were 142 bushels on ground that had looked like a write-off 2 years earlier. Gary sat with his coffee for a while after that. He didn't make a joke, nobody else did either. Phil Cross, the extension agent, heard the story a week later and reportedly said, "Well, Harold Fenton's going to love hearing that." He meant it as a compliment. One farmer, a younger man named Bob Dykeman, who farmed 600 acres west of town, drove out to the road along Eldon's north field sometime in late October after harvest and just looked at the stubble for a while. He later told his wife that he wasn't sure what he was looking for. He thought he'd know it when he saw it. He went home and called the extension office about inoculated red clover seed the following morning. In the spring of 1982, Eldon Marsh received a phone call at his farmhouse from Gary Pitchford. Gary said he'd like to come out and look at the operation if Eldon didn't mind, walk the fields, talk through what Eldon had done. Eldon said he didn't mind. Gary came on a Saturday morning in April. He wore work clothes, not his usual presentation clothes. He brought no salesman energy. He walked the North 80 with Eldon and asked specific, careful questions about the clover variety, the seeding rate, the inoculant, the timing of the cattle rotation, the tillage system after clover plowdown. He did not mention the dinner bet. Eldon did not mention it either. It wasn't necessary. What Gary said at the end of the walk, standing at the gate looking back across the field, was this: "My grandfather used to say the same things. I thought he was just being old." Eldon said they usually are, and they usually aren't. Gary went home and that fall seeded 200 acres of his rented ground to a clover grass mixture. It was a beginning. He was a different farmer for it, not a converted one, not a simple one, but a farmer who now held 2 ideas at once, which is the hardest and most necessary thing. Eldon Marsh farmed his 340 acres by the principles he and Harold Fenton had rebuilt until 1997, when a degenerative hip condition forced him to slow down significantly. Dale Marsh took over primary management of the farm at that point, and he has run it since, now with his own son, Travis, who is in his mid-30s and has a degree in soil science from the University of Missouri. Travis Marsh's senior thesis, written in 2009, was on long-term soil organic matter recovery in previously degraded cropland. He used his grandfather's farm as a case study. The North 80 acres that Eldon had ceded to Clover in 1979, managed continuously on the rotation system since then, tested at 4.1% organic matter in 2008. The best fields on the farm, the ones Eldon never allowed to degrade badly, tested at 4.8%. Travis's thesis advisor told him it was one of the best documented on-farm case studies of soil recovery she had encountered. Travis said his grandfather would have said, "Thank Harold Fenton." Harold Fenton died in 1989 at the age of 82. He is buried in a small cemetery near Ladonia. His copy of the 1934 USDA Soils and Men Yearbook is on a shelf in the Marsh farmhouse kitchen next to the coffee maker. And let me ask you something, because I think this question matters. What is the cost of being right before everyone else believes you? What does it cost a man to hold a true thing quietly in the face of mockery for years? I think Eldon Marsh paid that price without much drama. He just kept farming. He let the dirt make the argument for him, and eventually the dirt won. Bob Dykeman, the farmer who drove out to look at the stubble and then called the extension office, transitioned 60% of his acreage to legume-based rotations between 1982 and 1988. He later served on the Audrain County Soil and Water Conservation District Board for 12 years. Phil Cross left the Extension Service in 1985 to work for the Rodale Institute, a non-profit research organization dedicated to organic and regenerative farming systems, where he conducted research on cover crop economics for 8 years. The Co-op Diner on Route 22 closed in 1991. The building is a hair salon now. Gary Pitchford farmed until 2003, when he sold his rented acres and retired. By the time he sold, he was rotating clover into every 4th year on all his ground. In a profile in the Mexico Ledger in 2001, he was asked what single change had most improved his operation over 30 years. He said, without apparent irony, getting the biology right. The reporter asked who had taught him that. Gary thought for a moment. A neighbor, he said. I was too slow to listen the first time. Let me tell you what I take from this. Not the agricultural science. You can find that in 1,000 soil health textbooks now, and it's been validated by researchers on 6 continents. The science of what Eldon Marsh did is settled. Legume nitrogen fixation, soil organic matter, biological fertility, these are not controversial ideas. They were not controversial in 1978 either to anyone who had looked at the research honestly. They were just inconvenient because the money was flowing the other direction. What I take from this is something older than soil science. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the hands of people who have done a thing for a long time, who have paid attention over decades, who have listened to what the land or the river or the workshop tells them when it's honest. It is not always the knowledge that wins the argument in the meeting. It is not always the knowledge that has the slickest brochure or the most confident salesman or the most zeros in the budget behind it. But it is often, not always, but often the knowledge that turns out to be right. Eldon Marsh didn't outfarm Gary Pitchford because he was smarter. He outfarmed him because he asked a different question. Everyone else was asking, how do I maximize what I can extract from this land this year? Eldon, because of Oscar, because of Harold Fenton, because of an honest look at a soil test that scared him, was asking, how do I restore what this land has lost so that it can keep giving for the next generation? Those are not the same question. They produce very different answers. And the second question is much harder because its rewards are delayed, and delay is something that modern economics, modern culture, modern everything has a very low tolerance for. We are not, most of us, patient people. We have been trained not to be. We want to know the results now. We want the yield this season, the return this quarter, the proof immediately. Waiting for the land to respond, waiting for the biology to rebuild, waiting for the organic matter to climb back toward what it should have been, that is a 3 to 5 year proposition, and 3 to 5 years feels, when you are watching your neighbors get results now, like an eternity. But the land does not respond to urgency. It responds to time, to patience, to the slow, invisible work of bacteria and fungi and earthworms and root channels that no yield monitor can see, that no satellite can image, that no chemical salesman can put in a brochure. It responds to being cared for by someone willing to go broke for 3 years to get the next 30 right. That is not a farming lesson, that is just a lesson. Eldon Marsh was not a remarkable man by the measures most people use. He had no advanced degree. He owned no extraordinary equipment. He wasn't charismatic or loud or politically connected. He was a 53-year-old farmer in a flannel shirt with enormous rough hands who knelt in his field before sunrise and pressed 2 fingers into the earth and listened. And what the earth told him, what it had been telling anyone patient enough to listen for 10,000 years, was this. Give me back what you've taken, trust the slow things, don't mistake speed for progress. The biology is the work, the rest is just chemistry. He listened. The clover grew. The soil came back. And nobody laughed anymore. If this story resonated with you, if you have a farmer in your family who held to old ways when the world told them to let go, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, because these stories are everywhere. We've just stopped looking for them. And if you're new to The Forgotten Farmer, welcome. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are hundreds of them buried in the soil of American history waiting to be told. Thank you for watching.